Welcome to the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. I am the sports editor of the Herald Democrat, Jason Del Rosa, and you're listening to a brand new year, 2021, of the Herald Democrat Sports Podcast. We are about to kick off another football season as close to normal as we can possibly be in these ever-changing and uncertain times. We are back to having all the teams start the last week of August. That was different from last year. For those who obviously remember, Sherman and Denison and Texoma Christian started about a month later than everybody else. So we had a staggered COVID-19 schedule between the big schools and the small schools, but we are going to kick off all 14 Texoma teams here in Grayson County starting this Friday, August 27th, with one game on a Saturday, which we'll get to as we run everything down. We hope it will be as normal as possible. Unfortunately, games around the state have already been canceled for the opening week. Some of those teams have found other opponents and been able to play. Some are still searching. So this could be, unfortunately, sort of a weekly thing. So I always implore you to remember that when this gets taped, everything is as up to date as possible in regards to that. And if there is a change when you hear it, unfortunately, that's the reason why I might be talking about a game that does not exist by the time you listen to the podcast. So we're going to do the best we can. I think everybody's going to do the best we can. We were able to get through a full season as sort of altered and different as it was last year, and I think everybody's plan is to do that as well this year. And so standard operating procedure with myself, we'll be doing the podcast every week to, in this case, preview the season and the games coming up, and then once we get into actual gameplay, do a little recap of the week before and what comes ahead and what that all means, who's playing well, who's not playing well, pretty much all the way through till the last team is standing. And in addition to the podcast, of course, if you subscribe to the Herald Democrat, and we thank you for that, whether you get your information in the actual hard copy edition or if you have a login subscription, digital subscription to our website, heralddemocrat.com, you will get the usual coverage that you should come to expect here at the Herald Democrat. You will get preview stories, you will get the preview capsules, you will get all the scores and the game coverage that we do on Friday nights. All that stuff, like I said, always available in the paper and online as soon as possible. Player of the Week, which comes out on Wednesdays. So there's usually something every day for somebody to get their high school football fill. So without further ado, we will kick off a brand new season, week 1 of 2021. And of course, we're going to save the best for last. We're going to build up to that. So we will start with the first game. All these are non-district games, and they will all be 7:30 kickoffs on Friday, unless I note otherwise. And the first game that we're going to talk about is one of those games that has a different start time. This is Van Alstyne traveling to Boyd. This game is actually going to kick off at 7 o'clock on Friday, so be aware of that for the Panther fans that will be traveling out to Yellow Jacket Stadium. Van Alstyne last year went 3-8. Boyd went 8-3. This is a game that did not get played last year because of, and I'll mention this a couple times, because of COVID-19, some schedules got altered. Last year, Gunner and Van Alstyne opened against each other, and Boyd played Mineral Wells. So this is a slight change to that schedule. And so the last time that these teams actually met was almost a decade ago in 2013 in a playoff game. Boyd is a 3A Division I team, and Van Alstyne's 4A Division II. So obviously, unless Boyd moves up because Van Alstyne's continuing to grow, all these would have to be non-district games. There wouldn't be a chance for them to meet later in the season. And so to touch on Van Alstyne, like we said, so they were in 4A Division II last year. They moved up to 4A in the last realignment. and it was a mixed bag for the Panthers. Obviously, you have a 3-8 record. That's not good. But they also made the playoffs in their district. They were able to finish fourth in the 5-team district. They beat Crum, and that was good enough to get them a playoff spot. And then they lost to perennial power Graham in the first round. It was a young team. They talking with Coach Miller, and you can find on our website as well. I'll throw this out there too. All the season previews have been coming out over the last week or so, 2 a day, either in the paper and then on the website. So by the time you're listening to this, pretty much everybody should be on the website if you go there to try to catch up to find your favorite team. And when I talked to Coach Miller, he knew with last year's group, for the people that they were losing, even if they had stayed down in 3A Division I and would have been in a really good district like they have been recently, it was going to be a struggle and a learning curve for the new people they put in. There were a lot of first-time starters at the varsity level for the group that had come before them, and then throw in some injuries that they had to deal with. They had like we mentioned, not only their first game, they had some other games get changed through the course of the season because of COVID. They just had to pick up games to play them, and I think if they would have played the opponents they would have regularly scheduled, I think they potentially could have had a winning record or at least close to it. It just luck of the draw on some of the teams that were available for some of those weeks. But they do have some key guys coming back. On offense, namely that would be at quarterback with Gavin Montgomery, who jumped in as a starter last year. It was a dual threat. He ran for over 1,000 yards. You can also throw the ball. Dakota Howard was a sophomore last year. He's a big play wide receiver. You can throw it deep, let him go get it. That's a combination that's going to look to produce some big things again this year. And the defense has some guys back. They're in their second or maybe even third year starting. And I think it's going to be a more cohesive group. Like I mentioned, injuries did hurt them. Jaden Mahan, the running back, got hurt. I believe if it wasn't the first game in district, it was the second game, and so that kind of hampered things there. But at worst, when you're looking at Van Alstyne again, and probably after the season we'll do a realignment sort of look once we get a sense of how things are shaking out there. At bare minimum, they know what they need to do to make the playoffs, and that is to beat arguably Crum. Aubrey won the district last year. Salina was second, and Sanger was third. So you know who you have to beat in order to move up in the seeding standings, because otherwise whoever gets fourth place in this district is most likely going to get Graham again. So you want to try to at least find a way to pick off one of those other teams in front of you. And I think Van Alstyne is going to be better prepared to handle that. And they're going to kick that off against Boyd, who is coming off their best season in almost a decade. The last time they had this many wins was 2012, and it's just the second time since 2008 that they had at least 8 wins in a season. They were able to get into the playoffs in the district of one of the teams that we're going to talk about next, and that's the second big local matchup behind a certain 5A rivalry. But this is going to be Whitesboro traveling to Bells, and this is the other all-local sort of big kickoff game that I think a lot of people are interested in seeing. Last year, this was a defensive slugfest. This was a game that I covered because of the staggered schedule with Sherman and Denison starting late, and Bells won that game 20-6. The Panthers went on to go 9-3, their second straight 9-win season, and Whitesboro ended up finishing 4-6. They got off to a really slow start. They were trying to figure some stuff out offensively, and then they got into district play. Were able to get those wins to tie for fourth place, but unfortunately they ended up losing out to Paradise on a tiebreaker, and so they were trying to go for 10 straight years of playoffs, and they unfortunately came up a tad short. So this is a really fun game to start off with. Obviously, like I said, you have two teams that think that they are playoff caliber. Bells finished second to Gunner in the district. And all three of their losses were to playoff teams. They lost to Holiday in non-district. And for those who obviously pay attention to the runs that Gunner's made, Gunner and Holiday have usually met in the region final. That was not the case this year. But they did play Eastland in the playoffs, and that was the team that eliminated eliminated Bells before losing against Gunner. So all three of Bell's losses were to three of the best teams in the region, and obviously nothing to be ashamed of there for the Panthers. But they did make the region semifinals last year before realignment brought them back from Region 3 into Region 2, and they brought a lot of guys back last year. So they were expecting big things, even though they were in a district with Gunner, and they obviously weren't able to sort of match that big run that they had last year or 2 years ago. And so they're looking to do that this year. They do have a lot of guys back, especially on offense. Basically all the running backs are back. Bo Baker, who's a senior, is a 3-year starter at running back. He started as a freshman as a wide receiver. His brother Brock Baker is a junior. He had over 1,000 yards last year in his first year. And Grady Waldrop is a third-year guy, third-year starter as a junior, and he almost got to 1,000 yards. So they've got three capable guys. Blake Rowland is a senior quarterback. He's run the show for the last 3 years since Coach West got over there, and they're expecting big things. They do have some holes to fill on the offensive line. They do have some new faces in the receiving game, even though they don't throw a lot, but obviously those guys block. So they have some changes there. Some of the bigger changes were on defense. They lost a majority of the starters on that side of the ball, but they still have some guys there. Cooper Smith was a guy who jumped in immediately and has on the defensive line and been able to contribute up front. The linebackers, they have some guys there. Cameron Payne is a guy who's all-district selection last year. And then you have some guys in the secondary. I mean, Bo Baker's back there. Caden Pyle's back there at safety spots. Corners will be new. And I think, the big thing with them, obviously, is if their offense is running like it has been, they're really hard to stop. But I think, once again, the Gunner Bells matchup is going to decide who wins that district. I think the winner gets first place and the loser gets second place. And then Bells won all their other games in the regular season except for that game where they went to Holiday. So that it's going to be interesting to see how that rematch goes, to see where those two teams kind of stand after the pieces that they lost. And then Whitesboro, like we said, really got off to a bad start. Could not really score. The defense carried them for about the first 5 or 6 weeks to give them a shot. And the thing about Whitesboro too was they played a really good schedule. All the teams that they played early on were playoff teams. So it's not like you look at their schedule and say, they lost to bad teams. They hit sort of a murderer's row by the end of the season to where okay, you kind of understand, kind of how they struggle with those teams. Obviously, when you're playing, when you start off with Bells, Aubrey, and Gunner, who I think combined, those three teams had 3 or 4 losses in the regular season between the two of them, and obviously one of Bells' losses was against Gunner in district play. That's a really tough start when you have a lot of sophomores. You're playing double-digit sophomores after you lost a big and talented sort of senior class that was sort of continuing on the tradition or the recent tradition of Whitesboro of making the playoffs. And it took a while to figure things out. They're sitting at 1-5, and things are not going well. There's 4 games left in the season, and Whitesboro wins 3 of them. Put up some points. The defense, like I said, the defense was really good. And it just so happened the one game that they lost in that final stretch, they lost to Paradise by a touchdown, 8 points technically. And that obviously was the difference. If Paradise, if Whitesboro had won that game, they would have gone to the playoffs. And that essentially turned out to be a winner advances, a loser goes home with the second to last game of the season. So Whitesboro won their last game, but they needed help and they weren't able to get it, and so they were left home even though they finished 4-3 and had a really strong finish. And so that's been their motto, to have a better start, to not put them in that position. They settled in at quarterback with Mac Harper, who's a junior this year, and he kind of, like I said, he kind of figured things out as he went along, and the defense, I said, except for playing basically Brock, who ended up winning the district championship, they were really, really good last year. And like with any team, you lose bits and pieces, and they did lose some guys. They have multiple guys because they've started some of these guys so much younger. They have a Jacob Smith. They have a Sterling Garton at some of the linebacker spots to help out. You have some guys that hopefully you don't have to go both ways. But that's something that obviously depth and injuries may have them dealing with that as well. Paul Velton is a guy who was first team All-District on the defensive line. That's where probably most of the faces are going to be new as just part of a rotation. But like I said, for the most part, you have guys that had really successful seasons last year on defense, and the question is going to be, can that success that you had with Harper at quarterback, Smith is going to sort of be more of a multi sort of jack of all trades, starting at receiver. Grayson Ledbetter in the backfield, was sort of a backup as a sophomore. He's going to get most of the carries. If that group can figure it out and they make some decisions with the offensive line, then I think you could see them get off to a better start. But like I said, it's a really tough road when you're starting with the people that you're starting with. In the next game, we have Pottsboro hosting Community. Pottsboro went 9-3 last year. Community finished 5-6. This was a game that Pottsboro won 42-13, and I don't know if it was necessarily that close. As sort of the flow of the game. Pottsboro has not lost a season opener since 2009. That's a pretty good indicator of the success that Pottsboro's had. It's interesting to look at this year's group because this is sort of the first year. You still have a couple of guys who were contributors, not necessarily starters, on that state runner-up team back in 2019. But basically the core of those guys are gone. Braden Plower at quarterback is gone. Titus Lyons at wide receiver is gone. Silas Barr, who started both sides of the line, now up at Oklahoma State. So this is as Coach Poe told me, this group is its own group, and they're about to do their own thing to try to make their own impact. And it's going to be interesting to see how Pottsboro handles that. You talk about some of the places around here that sort of reload and they don't rebuild. And this is one of those years with Pottsboro. We're gonna see how that goes. Obviously, they're in a very tough district. They tied for first, but everybody was so close in that district. With them, Mount Vernon, Mineola, and Winsboro, there were a lot of tough games, a lot of close games, a lot of overtime games. So district is not going to be real fun. And as of right now, then I'm sure something will change, potentially with a team losing an opponent due to COVID. Right now, Pottsboro is only slated to have a couple of non-district games. They were scheduled to play Melissa right before their bye, before going into district play. So they were only supposed to have 3 non-district games. They'll play Community, and then next week they'll have the big game against Gunner, and then they played Melissa last year. Now that's a bye week, and then the regularly scheduled bye week is the week after that. So they're looking for a game, and unfortunately they haven't been able to find one in either of those weeks. So there's a chance that Gunner Pottsboro could go 3 weeks without playing a game until they open District 5 3A Division 1 play against Howe. So hopefully they can find somebody for their sake and for the kids' sake, especially senior guys, because you want to be able to play as many games as possible. And like I said, we may get to a point with this season that games get canceled or forfeited, especially in their district. They had two games get forfeited to them, both Commerce and Bonham. So even though they made the second round of the playoffs, they didn't actually get to play 12 games. They only played in 10. And so now you're down to 9, and you hope that you can find somebody and that you don't have to. If that happens again, you have some of these guys that only get to play maybe 7 or 8 games in their final season. On top of last year, a lot of juniors that got a lot of multiple year starters. You don't want to do that. You don't want to see that happen. So hopefully they'll find somebody. Jet Carroll, who stepped in at running back last year, is the front runner. I say front runner because there are 2 options, but it looks like Jet Carroll for his senior year is going to be the starting quarterback. Halen Flanagan is, if it's not Jet, Halen Flanagan would be the other name that you would need to watch against Community, and obviously if the score gets lopsided, you may see both of them play. Cooper Townsley dealt with some injuries last year. He was one of those guys as a sophomore that contributed to the state runner-up team. He started last year hurt, and then ended up playing a lot of defense only, with Carroll being the main running back. And there are some multiple options at running back. Besides Townsley, Cole Bynum, Major McBride was a guy who stepped in as a freshman last year because of the injuries, and he showed some flashes. Receiver, when you lose a guy like Titus Lyons, who's an all-state guy, you're gonna have to have some guys make up for that production. Jake Kubik is a guy who is sort of the front runner of this group. He was second team all-district. He caught 7 touchdowns. He averaged a touchdown every little more than about every 5 passes. About every 5 catches, he averaged a touchdown. Had almost 600 yards. As the second guy last year, and he's gonna probably have to take on that lead role. But they do have some experience there. Jude Bentley is back. He's a junior. Drake Hunter is a senior. Those were the other starting. They lost the Lions, but they brought back a lot of other guys. So they have some experience there. And then defense. You talk about guys who contributed 2 years ago. Tyler Ferris at defensive back is a guy that's gone. Graduation hit the linebacking group hard. Jackson Lipscomb's gone. Colton Cresswell's gone. Landon Dunaway's gone. So that's probably I don't say the biggest spot to look at because of so many new faces. Townsley, who is second team safety, is going to move up. Bynum's a guy to watch there. Hunter. There's a lot of guys sort of in that mix, and I think it's probably going to depend a lot on who's doing what on offense that will affect the defensive personnel, just to kind of get some guys a rest as the season goes along. So, there's always big things expected in Pottsboro just because of the streak that they're on. We said they obviously were co-district champions. They've won a district championship 6 of the last 8 seasons. They haven't had a losing record dating back to that 2009 season where they lost the season opener. And in that time since then, you're talking 10 wins, 9 wins, 11 wins, 11 wins, 12 wins, 11 wins, 11 wins. 2 years with 6 wins, they went 6-5 in 17 and 18, and then of course the 15-1 in 2019, and then another 9-win season last year. So that's always what these expectations are for the Cardinals, and I would imagine that this year is going to be no different, and we'll see how they start to gel as the season goes along. The next game that we're going to talk about is Howe hosting Callisburg. Howe is coming off an 0-10 season. Wacalsburg is coming off a 5-6 season, and if you're looking at the number one bright side for this game at Bulldog Stadium is that there will be turf. They are joining the latest of the Grayson County schools that have turf. Whitwright also will join them. We'll talk about their game here in a little bit. So now we're only down to a handful of teams in Grayson County that don't have turf. Sherman, Collinsville, SNS, and Tom Bean are the 4 left out of the 14 that don't have turf, and so that's obviously the big attraction that people will see when they get there. I know that they got that done just in time to be able to have the game stay at Howe. And on the field last year, the biggest thing with the Bulldogs were injuries. It seemed like every week guys were hurt, and then a guy would come back the next week, and then 2 more guys would be knocked out for whatever reason. And it was really hard to be consistent with just about anything they were doing. The offense really struggled, and it's just that cohesiveness of, there's 22 spots, and you can't have the same 22 every week, but when you're literally talking about 7 or 8 or 9 spots sort of up for grabs on a weekly basis, and you're bringing up JV guys to fill holes, and you're relying on freshmen to start. Even at the 3A level, that's just not, maybe you can get away with 1 or 2, or you have exceptional athletes that can make that jump and can maybe, serve in, backup roles and get playing time depending on scenarios. It's not going to work, and especially in the district that they're in that tough district with Pottsboro and those East Texas teams. And so Howe could never really get going. And the previous 2 years they were 3-7. They were sort of in the mix, and they had and I think they felt that they could potentially use that as a baseline if they had been healthy, have some winnable games on the schedule, and it just didn't work out for them. So they're gonna if there is a silver lining to having a season like that, is that you are basically bringing back everybody. Because you have so many guys with experience. You have so many guys that were just forced out there. They're going to start 2 seniors on offense and 3 on defense. And a lot of the guys are juniors and sophomores to sort of build, not just for what this season could be, but also for next year as well, because you had so many guys who got that experience last year. Austin Haley is back. He's one of those guys. Started as a freshman 3 years ago. Going into his junior year, still sort of running the show. And they're hoping that they can take advantage of some things with some other guys. In the backfield, Carson Daniels is going to be there. Bryce Crosby as well. Ryan Huff was honorable mention, all district at receiver. And there's some other guys out there that I think as long as they stay healthy, they can have some success. And Callisburg is going to be an interesting test for them. That was a group game. This was a game last year. I thought they kind of would have a chance to win. Callisburg ended up winning 48-8. Callisburg had Eddie Gill took over there last year. Like I said, they went 5-6 and made the playoffs. And they won as many games last year with those 5 as they did the previous 4 years combined, when they only had 6 wins in the 4 years before 2020. So now obviously you're facing a team, and they're like Howe. They brought a lot of guys back. So this is going to be an interesting matchup right off the bat for Howe, just because of who they have coming up as well. Their schedule does not. Their non-district schedule is not that easy either. They have Bells next week. They have a 4A team in Sanger the week after that before they kick off district play. But I think the biggest thing that you want to see from Howe is you want to see a better competitive level based on the scores from last year. Howe only scored more than 10 points twice. And a lot of the games that they lost, the scores were really lopsided. They gave up a bunch of points and they didn't score a lot of points. So if at worst you close the gap. That's obviously a good sign that you've gotten better. And of course, ultimately it may just come down to health. But we'll see what Howe can do when they host Calsburg on the new turf on Friday night. One team perhaps that Howe might be able to emulate, or would hope to emulate at least, is SNS. And they are playing at Paris Chisholm to open their season. SNS is coming off a 6-5 season and a trip to the area round. And Paris Chisholm is coming off a 5-6 record. And this is a game that did not get played last year. SNS played Tom Bean. They beat Tom Bean 70-0 at SNS, and that kicked off a major turnaround for the Rams. They were 0-10 in 2018. They went 1-9 in Josh Allman's first year in 2019, and they made that big jump to get third place in District 8 3A Division II, and finished 6-5. They won their opening playoff game against Blooming Grove before losing in the second round. So this is a new game for them. Chisholm opened last year against Union Grove, and they had to find a different opponent as well. And so this is an interesting matchup because obviously this is a bit of a step up for SNS compared to Tom Bean, which is coming off a down season as a 2A team. Now you're playing a Chisholm team. Even though their last winning record came in 2009, obviously they were a playoff opponent, and you don't have the sort of the scouting report of playing the team last year. And SNS has some changes to make if they're gonna keep this upward trend going. Obviously, none's bigger than the quarterback when you lose a quarterback. Who was an all-district guy, second-team all-district pick in Jake Reynolds. Who ran for over 1,000 yards and had 16 touchdowns on the ground, and then threw for almost 800 yards and had 3 touchdowns there. SNS was more of a run-oriented offense, and they have to replace both quarterback and running back. Coda Richardson is going to get the nod initially, but there are some other guys sort of pushing to get that spot, but Coach Allman seems to think that Richardson's going to be his guy at quarterback. And the big thing was with the offensive line is everybody is coming back. Everybody is having to be replaced. Pardon me. And so that's obviously another major focus is finding the right mix. I think they've sort of locked in those spots, but you don't know what you're going to get because it's a brand new line. You've got a brand new quarterback, a brand new running back is taking over. Gavin Collins is going to be that guy, and you have some guys that are going both ways, and so that's going to be interesting because Collins and Richardson were both second-team all-district linebackers. You have some guys who are receivers. Who are going to be, in the secondary. You have obviously some offensive linemen that are looking to be some defensive linemen. So the biggest thing there is probably going to be depth, but also how are SNS gonna how are they going to handle these raised expectations? As Coach Allman told me, they're not sneaking up on anybody this year. I'm sure a lot of people looked at them last year. Here's a program that's 1-19 the last 2 years, and their only win was against Calsburg, who themselves was a 1-9 team. So they didn't look scary, and they had a new coach, and they weren't able to get it going immediately. So I'm sure a lot of people last year thought, okay, that's a win for us, and it turned out not to be. The defense was really good. And the offense did just enough to grind out some games, and they were able to make the playoffs. And so now people are, you know what to expect from them now. And I don't know if some people just either took them lightly. They're definitely not being taken lightly, especially in district. They had 2 games that were really close, and they were able to pull those out. So both against Leonard and Whitewright, and that's basically what got them the third seed for the playoffs. And so it's a big step forward for SNS, and we'll see if they can somehow continue to make that happen. Next game, also out of that district, we have White hosting Clarksville. Matchup of the Tigers. Both of these games the last 2 years have been close. Last year Clarksville won 17-14, and Clarksville finished the season at 2-8. So they won their first two games, and then had an 8-game losing streak to end the season. White finished 5-5, and unfortunately their last game was a loss that was a forfeit because of COVID-19 protocols. They weren't able to play rival Leonard in what was essentially a playoff game because the winner was going to the playoffs and the loser was staying home. And unfortunately, that game could not be decided on the field, and White was not able to make a return trip to the playoffs after getting there in Kevin Wiggins' first year. They did win 5 games again, so that's sort of their baseline. But obviously there was a lot of disappointment about that because they were unable to get back to the playoffs again. A lot of guys are back for them. I know I've kind of said that with a lot of people, but they only had 4 senior starters. Now they were 4 guys who did start both ways. So essentially you are replacing 8 starters in that regard. But they dealt with the Tigers dealt with some injuries as well. So they have some guys that they weren't quote unquote full-time starters, but they were able to start here or there. So they have some experience. Caden Caraway's back at quarterback. He was first team All-District. He threw for over 1,400 yards and with 13 touchdowns. He also ran for 10 touchdowns. And on defense, he was a second team All-State safety. Picked off 9 passes, had 3 return TDs off of those. So he's the man to watch, obviously. But they have some other guys back. Colby Jones was the starting running back last year as a junior, so he's back. Zy Daniels is a guy who saw time in the backfield, saw time at receiver, did some things there. He's also an all-district corner. So he's got he's obviously got some great experience. They've got Jeremiah Ballard, who's a senior, who's a two-way starter on the offensive and defensive lines. Linebackers, probably the one issue for them as a group. They lost a lot of people there, and so that's sort of been the focus in trying to find some people to win some battles, win some spots, because there are a lot of new faces there. But it's going to be interesting to see. Like I said, in that district. For White, it's going to be a battle. It's probably going to come down to that Leonard White game again. The winner would have a tiebreaker / get in outright. So that's going to be interesting to see what the Tigers can do. And they'll kick things off when they host Clarksville, try to get a little revenge for their close loss last year. And then the last 3A team that we will talk about, saving the best for last with the 3A schools, is Gunner. They're going to host Sunnyvale, who was 6-5 last year, and of course Gunner had another great season. They went 13-2, made the state semifinals as the Region 2 champion in Division 2 for the 5th straight year. So they're trying to go for number 6. Of course, if you know anything about Gunner's history, that means that if they made the state semifinals, they must have played Canadian, which they did. And as has sort of been the case the last couple of years, the winner of that has gone on to win the state championship. And this, unfortunately for the Tigers this year, they lost against Canadian in a game that was not close, one of the few times in this now, as we enter the 6-year run of Gunner, that they were actually not in the game, as Canadian was ready to avenge their loss last year when Gunner was on the way to winning their second state championship in the last 4 years. So they got their revenge, and then they went on to win the championship. I think everybody fully expects them to meet again. Canadian did lose a lot, but I think most people still kind of view them as the class of Region 1. Gunner did not lose a lot. They basically bring back everybody. They lost one starter on offense and 2 starters on defense. And there are 22 starters, so that means they brought back 18 starters. And a lot of those guys were young. There were a lot of sophomores that contributed last year. And everybody sort of looked at if they were able to make another deep run, which they were, or I don't say God forbid, from the outsider's perspective, if they would have won the whole thing last year, to go back to back and then bring back all the people that they were going to, it was. I mean, you could really put together something because of all the people they have back. It's going to start at the quarterback spot. Hudson Graham is back. This is his 3rd year as he enters his senior season running the offense. He's committed to Texas Tech as a safety. So obviously you have a Division I athlete, a power conference athlete running your offense. He was the district MVP last year. He threw for 2,009 yards and 20 touchdowns and ran for 650 yards and 14 scores. 2 juniors who were sophomores last year with big years. Ethan Sloan, he had 792 yards and 12 touchdowns rushing, and he had 651 yards and 8 touchdowns receiving. And then Ashton Bennett was just short of 1,000 yards and 16 touchdowns on 131 carries. So those are the big 3. Gunnar likes to run you over, and those are the 3 that'll do it. And for the first time, I think during this run, they had a guy as a true receiver in Cole Lemons, who was a big play go-to receiver. Not to take anything away from Ethan Sloan, but obviously he would line up in the backfield. He would get handoffs and pitches and that sort of thing. And what Gunnar does, they hadn't really they've thrown the ball, but they haven't had to throw the ball. For whatever reason, it hadn't been a big part of the offense. And then Lemons last year has 51 catches for 1,001 yards and 11 touchdowns. Was honorable mention All-State, and he also started on defense as a defensive back. He picked off 11 passes there, and so this offense, it's very hard to compare teams. Everybody likes to do it. Which team was the best team? Which team had the best offense? This year and last year probably have a chance to be the most diverse of the Gunnar offenses based on what they can do offensively and defensively. Offensively with passing and receiving, they have some weapons, and just it really opens things up compared to what they did before. And of course you have an offensive line that basically brings everybody back. They would be bringing everybody back except for the fact that Trey Obas, who was at tackle the last 2 years as a starter, he's going to be the tight end. So they're shifting him outside a little bit. But you have guys there who are all either all district selections or honorable mention All-State selections. With 3 seniors and a junior who have a chance, to be one of their better lines just based on the experience and what they've been doing for the last couple of years. And I don't think anybody expects anything different this time around. And again, on defense, that's where they do lose 2 key players. Mitchell Brewer, linebacker, he was the district defensive player of the year, and defensive end Martin Garcia, he was second team All-State. So that's 2 big pieces, but again, we're talking about a group that brings back 9, and a lot of them obviously were big playmakers. Mason Peacock was the district newcomer of the year as a sophomore. Some of the guys that have secondary roles on offense, Saul Rodriguez and Caden Rigsby, were first team all-district linebackers last year, so they're back. Rigsby was also honorable mention All-State. Sloan will play on defense. Lemons, like we mentioned, had 11 interceptions. Cade Dodson started last year as a freshman. Senior Cooper Wade is one of the few senior guys on that side of the ball. So it's probably going to be a lot more of the same when it comes to Gunner, and obviously the expectations are at the very least to return to the state semifinals, and then once you get that far, you're playing. I said probably playing Canadian, playing one of the best 4 teams in the state, and we'll see if they can find a way to get back to AT&T Stadium and play for another championship. And I think that's what they're expecting to do. And this will be an interesting test off the bat because, like we mentioned when we talked about Van Alstyne and Gunner played each other to open. Gunner was supposed to play Sunnyvale last year, but because of the mixing and matching of some counties were not letting people play, so you had to find new opponents, and then people just kind of got stuck with the new teams they were facing. Gunner and Van Alstyne decided to play. Sunnyvale played Waco Connolly after they were allowed to play. After it was too late to get Gunner back on the schedule. And Sunnyvale is normally pretty good. They're a 4A team. So this is an interesting first test right off the bat for Gunner to kind of see where they stack up. And obviously they have a big game against Pottsboro next week. And then they have Whitesboro and Pot Point. So they've got four teams that you could be looking at the end of the season. 4 playoff teams, 4 really good stretches of athletes to deal with before getting into district play. Just a couple more games down here before we get to the big one at the end. We have Collinsville is hosting Blue Ridge. Collinsville's coming off a 6-4 season last year. They made the playoffs, lost in the first round. Blue Ridge went 4-6, just missed the playoffs in that district with Bells and Gunner, SNS, and Whitewright. This was a close game last year. Collinsville won 30-29. They scored with 11 seconds left to get that win. Of note for Blue Ridge, their new head coach is Gunner's offensive coordinator for the last couple of years, Tim Wiley. So obviously, what you've seen out of Gunner in terms of personnel and how they use them, the pistol option. So I don't know how much you can compare Blue Ridge from this year to last year, just because they'll be doing something that's totally different. Collinsville, we talk about some of these teams bringing back a lot of people. Collinsville does have some holes to fill, and they are extremely young. They only have 1 senior on the entire roster. A lot of their key guys this year are going to be sophomores. This is sort of the double-edged sword for Collinsville. If they do well and make the playoffs again, they finished 3rd in their district behind Lindsay and Alvord. And that's a good sign for the next couple years because they're basically bringing back everybody, if that's the case. Lance Stone is a sophomore who's going to be taking over at quarterback. The plan at running back is to start a freshman named Garrett Trevino. Colin Barnes was a freshman last year, and he was able to contribute, whether it was as a slot back, as a receiver, just kind of get the ball in his hands however they kind of could. At receiver, they have one of the few upperclassmen in junior Nathan Bocanegra. He's a 3-year starter. He's been starting since his freshman year. He averaged a little over 23 yards a catch last year. Coming up with big plays. They do get a transfer from Tioga, down the road from Tioga, in Ryland Newman, who last year was a running back at Tioga. He's going to be a receiver for Collinsville, but he had 59 carries for 303 yards and a touchdown as a freshman. So he's got experience at the varsity level despite only being a sophomore. Offensive line is their big concern. They've got a whole new group, and they have some guys who are still recovering from some injuries last year, so they're not going to start with the 5 that they would hopefully want us to be able to have when they get to districts. So that's probably the biggest concern for Collinsville. Defense, a lot of the same names. And like I said, a lot of young guys. The whole secondary, the plan there is to go with sophomores. So there may be it's going to depend on the learning curve. If they figure it out fast enough, then they could be really dangerous, not just this year, but for years to come. So we'll see what Collinsville does as they get a good test, obviously based off of just last year having a close game as they host Blue Ridge. Tioga is going to go on the road to Petrolia. That is a 7:00 start. That's another one that's starting a little bit early. Petrolia is coming off a 1-8 season, and Petrolia is coming off a 7-4 season. And obviously the big news out of Tioga is that Chad Rogers came over from Denison after 9 seasons there, and is making his debut with the Bulldogs. And so that's obviously the number one thing there. How are they going to adjust to some of those changes? Obviously, it's basically a whole new staff, and they're looking to build things back up. Tioga had a streak of playoff appearances, 4 straight playoff appearances, snapped last year by winning only the 1 game. And they were another team that sort of like how, dealing with injuries, playing a lot of young guys, playing a lot of sophomores and freshmen because of that, and they weren't able to kind of get the traction that they would have hoped. And they've sort of struggled since moving up to 11-man. They've won only 5 games in the 3 seasons before this one, but the first 2 they made the playoffs because they were able to win those games in district that they needed to win in order to advance, and that just didn't happen this last year. Chase Evans was the main guy last year with them. He ran for almost 900 yards and 4 touchdowns, and he's going to sort of be the lead ball carrier there. But they've got some other young guys that they're going to work in there and sort of see how they fit. And I think that's sort of the biggest thing. Again, this is a group that's not senior heavy. You look at their, last year they started 4 sophomores on the offensive line, so all those guys are back. And again, they should all be back next year because they're all juniors. Like I said, so I think the biggest thing with Coach Rogers and his group coming in is, you've got to find the pieces that fit, not just for this year, but also to hopefully to kind of build for the future as well. And they've done that at a couple spots. You can kind of see what they're doing. Obviously, quarterback is a senior, Logan Westbrook. He had an injury sort of plagued season last year. They had to play 4 or 5 guys at quarterback. It did not go well, and that really limited them because teams knew they couldn't really move the ball through the air. Even if they wanted to, they were running a wing T offense, but there was that really removed sort of the threat in the passing game, and everybody sort of knew it. And then, like I said, you have those young guys in there. So again, I think like with Howe, it's a little bit different because the Tioga's district is smaller. They have a chance if they win a couple games, they could be in the mix for the final playoff spot. But I think ultimately the biggest thing is based on just the way the scores were last year and how sort of lopsided some of the games were. If you show that you're competitive, you close the gap, you can make some people sweat, and then they go, oh man, we've got to deal with a lot of these guys next year as well. They're working towards getting better. So that's sort of what Tioga's maybe starting point with a lot of young players and new coaching staff as they enter the season. And Petrolia, is coming off its best season since 2002, so they're jacked up. And this is a game that they won pretty easily last year, so I'm sure they're thinking, we're going to do that again. So we'll see what Tioga can sort of put together, see where they're sort of sitting when district play gets started, and maybe they can pick somebody off. The last 2A game that we have is actually a Saturday game. It will be at 7:30, but it's on Saturday, and it's all the way out in Seymour. This is Tom Bean against Morton. Tom Bean is coming in at 2-6, and Morton is coming in at 5-4. Although that 5-4 is as a 6-man program. So Morton played an outlaw schedule last year. They haven't been an 11-man team since 2016, and so they have enough players that they've actually they've moved up, and they're actually going to be in a district this year as an 11-man program. And so it's really hard to tell what that 5-4 sort of means. Tom Bean is 2-6. They had some COVID cancellations to their schedule, which is why they didn't play a full 10 games. They did beat Tioga in district, and they went into the last game of the season against Collinsville needing a win to have a chance to make the playoffs. But they came up short, losing that one. And Aaron Whitmire has taken over. He was an assistant last year, and now he's in charge. Also, a lot of changes with Tom Bean in terms of last year. They had a lot of seniors, so there's a lot of new faces. The big thing with them is going to be, when you sort of take that step back, they had made the playoffs 2 years in a row before last year, even though they did have a winning record, and then you sort of take that step back for whatever reason, whether it was COVID related or injury related, probably a little bit of everything. You're trying to build that sort of backup, and Tom Bean's in position to do that. They do have some experience on the offensive line. Some guys that got some playing time last year to kind of lock in there. Quarterback is either going to be looks like it's going to be a sophomore. It's either going to be Branson Ashlock or Gavin Hamilton. And whoever doesn't win that battle is going to be a receiver. Just because of their athletic ability. So that's obviously going to be interesting to see if they can sort of settle on a guy and be able to stick with that. Coach Whitmire told me he's not I don't want to play people and this guy gets one half and this guy gets another half, or rotating series or that side of thing. He wants to make a decision and sort of stick with it. And so, like I said, that's the biggest thing with them is you have a lot of guys who were not on varsity last year because of such that large senior group, so they're getting a lot of their snaps for the first time. And so that'll be interesting to see with Tom Bean. If they could just sort of figure things out early. There were a couple spots on both sides of the ball. They're still trying to figure out some position battles and sort of get back in the mix a little bit better than like I said. They went into the last week of the season with a chance to make the playoffs, and so you can't ask for much more than that. But obviously, getting a winning record, sort of making that be a habit, sort of the thing that Tom Bean's looking to do. And then we will touch on our 6-man game. Texoma Christian is at Irving Highlands. Texoma Christian last year was 1-7, and Irving Highlands was 4-4. TCS did make the playoffs last year. They finished third in their district. Their one win was in was in district play, and that got them into the playoffs. They lost in the first round. That was the first year last year, for those that remember. Texoma Christian did not play football because of the lack of players in 2019, and so last year was their first year as a 6-man program, and obviously there were growing pains. It was very much an up and down sort of season. They had some games where they played well, some games where they did not play well, even though they had the 7 losses. There were some games that they were competitive in, and they were still trying to figure it out. And this was a game that was supposed to be their opener last year, and unfortunately Irving Highlands had COVID-19 cases, so Texoma Christian had to find somebody else to play. So this will be interesting to see. There are some changes for Texoma Christian. Some guys did not come back out after last year. So Hayden Turner is going to take over at quarterback. He was a running back last year. But they do have some pieces. They do have some pieces from last year. Relatively speaking, they are young. So this is one of those deals where we could see the fruits of this labor be really good next year, depending on what district they're in with the realignment. But again, it was one of those things last year where because of this, they TAP started late because of the COVID-19 delayed schedule. They only played 7 games in the regular season, so they had 3 games get canceled or just more people weren't able to match up. So there were a bunch of bye weeks before they made it to the playoffs. Obviously, it doesn't help when you're dealing with all that, and you're making a move to 6-man for the first time off not even playing the year before. So you're trying to see what pieces fit and how fast the kids can learn. Coach Townsend was saying to me that they really missed playing a full schedule, and he thinks that would have helped them, especially get ready for district, because their district was so small last year. There was only 4 teams in the district. So they were having to really scramble to find opponents, and so that was an issue. There are a couple teams that got added into their district this year, and so they didn't have to find as many non-district games. Assuming everybody gets to play, all their district games. TCS is going to play 5 games in district. So it's a little bit more experience, and a lot of these guys, figured it out last year. They've been trying to get the younger guys, the incoming freshmen, ready, because you kind of need an all hands on deck attitude with a 6-man level, because you don't have a lot of bodies to begin with, and pretty much a lot of guys are going both ways. So that's everybody except for the big one. 123rd Battle of the Axe, Denison at Sherman, 7:30 Friday, Bearcat Stadium. You have Denison coming off a 7-4 record last year, making the playoffs for the first time in 3 years, losing in the bi-district round. Sherman also making the playoffs, finishing 5-5. They had one of their games as a no contest because of COVID, so that's why they only have 10 games instead of 11. And this is the one that obviously everybody's been looking forward to. You have Denison still, as we talk about this every year, Denison has extended its winning streak to 8 games. They're going for number 9. Last year they won 41-23, and this is the longest winning streak Denison has ever had in this rivalry. And it's the 3rd longest winning streak in the series history just overall. Sherman has the first 2. And obviously the number one thing to talk about with this game is both teams have new head coaches. We mentioned when we talked about Tioga, Chad Rogers stepped down at Denison to go to Tioga. And then about a month later, in the spring, J.D. Martinez stepped down at Sherman after 5 seasons there to take the head football coaching position at Bridgeport. So then Sherman was looking for a coach. At Denison hired Brent Whitson, who was the head coach at South Grand Prairie, a 6A school. He was there for 10 years. And Sherman hired Corey Kane from Allen, who was their defensive coordinator for the last decade. And so that obviously is the number one storyline before anything else, that we have a brand new coach at Denison and a brand new coach at Sherman, and the first game of their careers is the Battle of the Axe. This is the first time that we've had new head coaches on both sidelines since 1945, and I know you all remember when Sherman's Finis Vaughn went up against Denison's Arnold Johnson, and that's the last time we had 2 new coaches at the same time in this game, and it's the first game, so I think the biggest thing is you don't know what to expect. I think you can look at what Coach Whitson did at South Grand Prairie, and you can look at what Coach Kane did at Allen for running his defense, but when you have them dealing with this personnel and these kids for the first time and trying to install your offense and your defense and how you want to do things and what you like to call in certain situations, and will you go for it on 4th and 2? Will you go for it on 4th and 5? Will you onside kick? Will you fake punt? We don't know anything about what these coaches are bringing to the table just because they're so new and there is no history, let alone against each other, but just with these teams. And so obviously That is the number one thing to look at going into this game, is that you have these new faces that are, one, experiencing this rivalry for the first time, and then how are they going to handle it. And the sort of twist is that they have faced each other in the playoffs at their old schools, and Whitson is more of an offensive guy, and obviously Kane is a defensive guy, so they have matched up against each other, and so you would assume what they would like to do in facing each other, but again, it's different personnel, and we'll get to that here in a second, but I don't know if you can rely on what you've done in the past, especially when the other guy knows what you like to do. So do you totally switch it up to give them a different look going into this game? And like I mentioned, so Denison has won this game, 8 years in a row. Sherman is obviously trying to end that streak. They don't want to have this happen, and if they do come away with a win, it's going to be with a lot of new faces. You're talking about an offense that is almost entirely new. We have a new quarterback in Phoenix Grant, the junior's taking over for a 2-year starter in Tate Bethel. Running back, Caleb Thompson did play some last year as a junior, but he was essentially the third guy behind Andrew Nabas, and Benji Amaibu was essentially either a 1B / number 2 because he was usually a receiver. The only receiver that's back is in a major role is Elijah Chapman, who's a senior. The other guys there are going to be new, and so obviously you have a quarterback who played defense in this game last year, but now is obviously the focus of the offense in trying to make things go there. You have a running back who is going to be the lead guy as opposed to being part of a rotation, and you have some new receivers who maybe saw some snaps, in some cases didn't even play in this game. So that's obviously the biggest thing for the offense. And you also have 3 new guys on the offensive line. So there's not a lot of experience when it comes to this Sherman offense, and ultimately is what they have done in the 2 scrimmages to get ready, and what can they do against a defense that has been very successful. And when we talk about the Denison defense here in a minute, that it's basically all returning. So it's going to be interesting to see what Sherman has in store with so many new people. I think we knew what Sherman was going to be offensively going into last year's game, because all those guys were back, and in some cases a lot of those guys were 3-year starters. They'd been starting since their sophomore year. And so that's going to be interesting from the offensive standpoint. Defensively, it's basically the same sort of thinking. There are a lot of new faces. The defensive line has the most experience. The ends are Armando Chavez and Anthony Gianfrido. Those guys are back from last year. Chavez was in the middle, and he shifted outside with Nolbert Cibrian going to offense to play tackle. And in the middle of the line now is Chaz Brown, who's a mountain of a Bearcat. And he got some snaps as last year went on. He just takes up a lot of space, and so they have the most experience. They have those are the people that you probably would remember from last year. But the linebackers are almost entirely new, and there's not a lot of senior guys on this side of the ball either. The 2 ends are up front, but when you talk about the linebacker spots, you're only talking about 1 senior there and a couple seniors in the secondary. So 7 of these guys are either juniors or sophomores. And you talk about, like, in the secondary, Connor Clark is back as a junior. He was an all-district pick last year. But the other guys, even though it's 2 seniors and a junior, they're guys who did not start or weren't even on the Sherman football team last year. They were either at another school or they were playing basketball. So it's going to be interesting to see how things fit for this defense. Like I said, they had moments in the scrimmages, both against Denton and Princeton. And the biggest thing, I think is, like you said, you have a lot of new guys, and this is their first game, and it's against Denison, and you're trying to end the winning streak by the Jackets, and so it's gonna be, like I said, it's gonna be really interesting from that perspective, and it's one of those deals where we know this game is going to be played every year, and so when you look at it and you see, like I mentioned on defense, there's only 5 guys who are seniors, and then you look at the other side, there's only 5 guys who are seniors. So you're almost looking at minimum for next year. You're looking at bringing back 11 guys, and that's compared obviously for this year. There's very few returning starters on both sides of the ball for Sherman. So they will have the experience upper hand on Denison next year. I know the focus is on this Friday night, but you're going up against a Denison group that basically brought back everybody from last year. This is sort of the step forward that I think a lot of Denison fans are hoping takes place. A lot of these guys are 3-year starters. As sophomores, they missed out on the playoffs on a tiebreaker in 2019. And then last year, you move up to 3rd place in the district standings behind Lovejoy and Frisco. And they came up just short in the playoff game against North Forney. They lost by a touchdown. And basically everybody's back. And when I say everybody, I'm saying you look at the offense, and 8 of the guys are back on offense. And obviously it's going to start with Jadarian Price, who's a 4-year starter at running backs, committed to Notre Dame. He enters this year 4th all-time in Denison rushing. He's got over 3,200 yards, and he is the focal point. But he is not the only option on this offense, because you have a quarterback in Caleb Heavner, who's a 3-year starter in his own right. And when you look at the Denison record books, he's in the top 5 in a lot of the main categories: completions, yards, touchdowns, and he'll be looking to add to that. 2 of the 3 receiver spots are 3-year starters in Trey Rhodes and Keegan Pruitt. Those guys have had moments, and obviously they said they're both 3-year starters. Jaron Hendricks is back at tight end. The right side of the line with a tackle and guard, Damian Smallwood and Will Gillespie is back. Kenyon Ives started down the stretch, and in some big games. The left side of the line is probably the issue, if you want to say there's an issue, because you have 2 sophomores there, and this is their first varsity experience. Like we said, when it's the Battle of the Axe, who knows? You don't know how kids are going to react until they get out there. But outside of that, and a receiver spot with Dylan DeHorney, who was a backup last year, 8 of those 11 spots are back, and half of them are 3-year starters. So you have a lot of experience on that side of the ball. And then when we talk about the defense, it's almost the exact same thing. One, you're talking about a defensive group that is starting 9 seniors and 2 sophomores. As we run down the senior guys, both of the defensive ends, Ja'Kalen Fields and Landry Massenberg, both 3-year starters. At linebacker, you have William Wallace. He's been a 3-year starter. When you get to corner, you have Jalik Lewis, who's a 3-year starter. DeTorian Johnson is moving from linebacker to corner, but he started last year, was an all-district pick. The 2 defensive tackles were both starters last year, Dakota Buttrell and Jude Walters. All those guys are seniors. They're all multiple-year starters. Denison has depth on the defensive line. They have a sophomore in Zadavian Sims, who already has an offer from Arkansas. He's not a starter because you have literally 10 years of starting experience, and you have another senior in Xavier Washington who's been a starter in the past. So that shows how deep the Denison defensive line is. The newcomers to the group, like I mentioned, so we have a sophomore at safety in Kenyon Kelly and a sophomore at linebacker in Jacoby DeHorney. And the other two safeties have some big shoes to fill because Keebler Wagner was the district's defensive player of the year, and Braden Maxwell is taking that spot's for Lane Tharp, and Braden Maxwell steps in for a first team all district selection as well. So you don't have just everyday guys just sort of filling in there. They're taking over for some really big shoes. There's a lot of playmakers on that side of the ball. So yeah, there are 7 of those guys back, but some of the pieces are pretty big. And like I said, you've got 2 sophomores on each side of the ball that are brand new, and this is basically their first big game in the spotlight as a starter. So we'll see how they handle that. And the last thing I will mention about this game, and I appreciate you sticking in this long, is if it is close and it does come down to the kicking game, I will point out that Sherman's kicker, Dane Castleberry, is back. He made 5 field goals last year, and so he has varsity experience. Logan Voigt is Denison's kicker. He is taking over for Reese Stange, who was a 3-year starter and kicked 18 field goals in his career. Kicked the most extra points in Denison history. So if it comes down to a late kick, who is the new guy for Denison going to feel it a little more than the guy who has kicked in this game before last year? So that could be something if it comes down to the end. Does that make a difference? It doesn't look like weather's going to be a factor. It's going to be hot like it normally is. Obviously, we're playing on grass instead of on turf. Maybe one day, perhaps in a new stadium, maybe somewhere located at the new high school, we'll be playing this game on turf when it's in Sherman. But outside of that, like I said, if it does come down to a late field goal, how will these kickers, one who has been in this game and one who has not, handle that pressure, especially knowing what's at stake, because one side has had the axe for so long and one side is trying to find a way and do anything possible to get the axe back where they feel it belongs. So that is a look at week 1. That is a look at some sort of season preview for all of our teams. It may be a little bit long this week. It'll probably be cut down lengthwise as we go forward. But obviously the first week is the biggest because it has quote unquote the biggest game. So I appreciate you listening. Be safe. I know things were going in a good direction. Things are starting to ramp back up. So I'm not telling you what to do. If you'd like to have football, try to maybe do some things to make sure that we have football. That we don't get to a point here in a month or so, and then we have to shut down for 2 weeks, or people have games get forfeited because nobody wants that. And I want everybody to stay healthy and enjoy a football season as much as possible. So that is the end of the week 1 /season preview. Again, this will be out hopefully Wednesday night, and every Wednesday is when the podcast will come out. So if you're planning to find it, go to heralddemocrat.com sometime on Wednesday night. You can follow me on Twitter, at Jason Della Rosa is my handle on Twitter, and also our All-Texomaland page and the Herald Democrat page on Facebook. All those social media, that there'll be links on all those as well. So again, enjoy the first week, and we'll talk to you later.